get maybe on, but now she was Rachel, and we really created a person. Like I felt like teary when she was spoken. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I need more sleep, but
Other people?
Yeah, it was intense.
Yeah. It is intense.
What we were just saying to each other is that as she was creating the timeline, what was interesting is then we got to a certain point, which was when the emotional eating started, and she automatically started going to, as we were finishing up the timeline, started going to the emotional eating, the weight gain, and all of that. So we then really did this, what you were saying, is this kind of back and forth that came really naturally out of it, so it's fun to experience that.
We went into a point that we felt got a little sticky because she went through all of her relationships and then she talked about her friends, how she kind of pulled back because she felt uncomfortable about her weight. And then kind of just pointed out that all of her relationships, she didn't feel she was lovable. And so, you know, it was like, you know, step lightly, how do we, you know, and so I was thinking to just maybe say, so you don't feel you're lovable because you have extra weight. And but the thing is, if she said yes, okay, and then where do you go?
Let's discuss it. What are your clinical gut reactions to that question?
My thought was just
Speak up.
to just sort of sit with that and hold the intense emotion and allow it to surface. And
I think that's a great reaction.
yes, yeah, allow it to be witnessed from the clinician and from the patient. And hold the space for it until they got done for
I think that's a nice reaction. What else?
Curious if she ever felt lovable in relationships, constant present, or if weight was something that was valued by a family member early on, or praised or criticism.
I felt like there's so many opportunities where you people, sort of you clinicians, knew her, knew pieces of her. I think you over here said like my mom was always very sort of svelte and, you know, like this is all, you guys said this is true. Okay? There was something about you just got just enough information to sort of know in your gut what are some of the triggers that she'd likely experienced earlier in her life. And I felt so much empathy and compassion. I mean, I felt like Terry myself just listening to the groups of people and how warm you were responding to her and how like even your facial expressions were really inviting and so really good work there. But yes, go.
I would also, at some point, say, you know, what is this experience like? Talking about this right now, here and now.
Yes. And then even reflecting can be really useful, right? So not, you know, so do you feel like you're, you know, you didn't say this, but not like, you know, do you feel like you're, I hear you saying your weight is related to your value or something, but, you know, just sort of like, it must be so hard to live feeling that way, right? Feeling that like when you gain extra weight, you're not lovable, or just sort of giving that, gosh, that must be really hard, which starts to set up the tone of like maybe there's another way to think about it, but that's, you know, that people have believed that for their whole lives, usually. So then it starts to get a little, you had a thought?
Oh, I just had a lot of trouble. No, try that. That's not true. I saw myself as the therapist all the time. I saw what I was doing. I saw the moment when Rachel said, you know, I really like, I would eat chocolate. I really like chocolate. And I would laugh and say, yeah, we all really like chocolate, don't we? And that's a classic Alison intervention all the way through aging. And I noticed that a lot.
And you were playing therapist?
When I was the therapist.
When you were the therapist.
But not laughing all the way through. That's not what I noticed, but I noticed classic Alison.
Yeah.
And that was a bit problematic because, you know, this is new for me, this model, and so I kept wanting to deviate onto for me to say in that mindset.
So I actually encourage you to be you in using IPT. I personally, even though I have not been very funny this last 2 days, I'm actually really a funny person. In clinical work, humor is one of my favorite tools, actually. And so I use that a lot. And not in a obviously sarcastic or mean way, but just a really relatable way. So if that's your style, you be you. Because if you're trying to like fit into a different method, you lose all the clinical gut that you've developed over the years. So definitely be you, and just think, this is a brand new skill set, right? And so there's gonna be times when you're like, that's not working, go back to what I know, then do that, right? But just sort of think of it as, maybe you have more tools now, so if a case seems challenging, or if you want to sort of do some peer supervision around IPT, right, you'll still develop those skills. You're not supposed to be expert after leaving here, just thinking of yourself as having new tools that you can use. So.
Yeah, it always feels a bit constrained, I can't just bring it into the moment. And I think I'll do that, but what I didn't hear, yeah, so it's amazing.
Other thoughts or anything? Okay, so that's Rachel. Did you guys just generally have a sense of her problem areas?
Oh, yeah.
What are they?
Oh, flattening out and distancing.
Flattening out and distancing, which in the IPT model might sound like what? Interpersonal deficits? Yep. Yep. Yeah. So all of those, right? And I think this is a beautiful opportunity, and depending on how you role played, I know, things were more emphasized in one versus another, but that's what it's really like in clinical care, right? This same story applied to two different people, the role transition might not have been as huge for one person as it was for another, even if the timeline looks the same and everything. So you have to sort of roll with the person sitting in front of you. I trust your clinical gut to tell you where to go with that. And also, yes, you're talking to the client about it, right? You're saying, there's lots of different things going on here. This one sounds like it's sort of more related to the struggles you've been having with your eating. But if that's not how you feel, then let's talk about that, right? Sort of redirect me if I'm off. And so, and I've had patients do that, absolutely. Because what sometimes, we'll hear something and it's like, ding, it sets off a bell for us, and we want to go down that path, and the patient's like, oh, no, that's long gone. I want to go here. Then listen to the patient. You can. So again, this goes back to, it depends on how you've structured your sessions. So if you have longer sessions, like 90 minutes, which is my ideal, then I might have time to do both. I find that they sort of flow naturally from one another in a lot of cases, not always. But you can also split them up if it feels like, one patient is really invested in talking about the relationships in the first, and they have a lot of people on their circle and that sort of thing, then you might not have time to do the timeline too. So you can split it up. Again, it's really about formulating the case.
And does it matter if you do the timeline or the circle first?
Personally, I think the circle comes first because you're going to see names show up on the timeline, and it's helpful to have a sense of who they are. So if you do the timeline first, and your patient is Rachel, she's going to say, I got married. Oh, your natural inclination is going to say, tell me a little bit about your husband, but then you're in the circle. So if you've done the circle, then you have a sense of oh, okay, right, that's Joe or whoever. So.
I have a question. Primarily we work with adolescents and young kids. So we would still do the same thing. It's just we have to downplay a little bit because she's 9 or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but there is binge eating and everything else.
Indeed.
So, would you recommend, because again, I'm an FPT, everyone's family, would you do this with the individual child, or would you do it with the parent present?
So when I've worked with adolescents, which are not 9, but 12, 13, I've done it with individual clients. And that is actually sort of helpful. It gives them some
Sure.
autonomy. And then also, you sort of get a sense of what is important to them. So it's not uncommon for a 12-year-old to say, you know, everything was going fine until my brother was born 5 years ago, right? Or
Right.
something like that, or my parents split up 2 years ago. So those big markers. Or one client, like this, she literally moved 2 houses down from where she was born, 2 houses down the street. But when her family moved 2 houses down, they had a big income jump, so they moved to a big house 2 houses down, and that cascaded a huge transition in her friend group, because suddenly her friends felt like, oh, right? Like they were in a relatively sort of moderate income neighborhood, and they moved into the big house, and that ricocheted through her peer group and through how she saw herself. So even though you're like, oh, you moved next door, that's no big deal, it was a huge deal for this particular client. So you sort of have to probe, right? That was a big deal to her. Okay, so I want to just walk you through, Jay, we've been talking about since the beginning of this talk, and so I'm just going to talk you through what actually happened. So as you may remember, Jay is a 36-year-old Caucasian, married, currently no child, but does have 1 dog, BMI of 40, around 30 objective binge episodes in the current month, diagnosis of binge eating disorder, and past alcohol abuse. So he has stopped drinking, but reports lots of binge drinking in the past, all through college, was really sort of extreme and excessive in his alcohol use. But I think he stopped drinking when he was like 30, sort of just was over it, basically, and stopped drinking, but clearly had a history of it. So interpersonal inventory, we took 5 sessions to get through his interpersonal inventory. He was very articulate and funny and outgoing, and so it was just fun talking to him, and he was verbose, so not inappropriately so, but just lovely to talk to, and so we spent some extra time. So as you may recall, in past interpersonal functioning, his father left home when he was around 7, which meant he assumed the care of his younger brother and a lot of household chores at the same time. His mother had to return to work. Those were sort of the primary things. His brother did start using drugs a little bit later. The current interpersonal stressors that he has a stressful work situation, so he's married by the time I'm working with him, or no, he was engaged by the time I'm working with him, sorry, I was conflating cases to not use actual patients, but, and his fiance was in nursing school, so he was the primary breadwinner. They lived together, were planning to get married, so he had a lot of pressure on him to maintain the household finances while his fiance was finishing school, and he works on commission, so in real estate, so potentially just fine, but also potentially not just fine, one of those situations. And the current precipitants to his episodes of binge eating were a lot of work stress, so if he felt like a deal was about to fall through, a very big trigger for him, understandably, as well as difficult interactions with his wife. That's supposed to say about weight, not about his wife, about his weight, and his brother asking for financial support. So the brother that he had sort of assumed responsibility for when they were younger and had used drugs periodically, now they're grown up, but his brother has still struggled and is sort of flailing, and occasionally out of the blue texts Jay or Jim and says, hey, like, I'm stuck, can I borrow $1,000? And so that causes a lot of stress.
Did you mean to put dog care?
What did I say? Oh yes, dog care is an issue, yes. So, yes. So they have 1 dog, and his wife does not want to walk the dog ever, even though she loves the dog and they agreed to get the dog together. So he has full 100% responsibility for the dog care. And he loves his dog very much, and he's happy to, but they do live in a 5th floor condo, so walking the dog is a pain in the rear, right? You have to go down the elevator every time you want to walk the dog. And so the wife is in school, so she has a much more flexible schedule than does he, but he's still responsible for getting up in the morning and walking the dog before they leave the house, getting home after work and walking the dog, feeding the dog, everything.
So was that agreed upon before they got
Nope.
the dog? Okay.
Nope. Just the way it has worked. So yes, dog care is an issue, and it is a stressor, for sure. Even though I know it seems like a small thing.
No, it's a big
Yeah, it's
deal.
not, yeah. So this is what his closeness circle looked like. So on the interior there is hid, and then in the close supports or important people, he has Mike and Chris. These are two of his former sort of longtime college friends. Importantly, what I discovered is that Mike and Chris both have recently had new children, like they had babies with their wives. And so he's at that age where his friends are starting to develop families, and he's on the path to do that, but just probably a couple years behind them. And all that means really is that they used to go sit and watch Sunday football together. They don't do that now because the dads are at wherever with the kid. So he has lost some contact with them, but they are a very important source of support for him. His wife obviously is very important, and his mom, so he comes from an Italian family. His family's very close. His mom lives 3 houses away from them, and she's very, very important to them, particularly because the dad left so early. She has, he and the mom have really sort of been the team for a long time. That's not always good, but he considers her a very important person in his life. On this outer ring, his mother-in-law to be, his brother and his boss, all of them are important in that he spends a lot of time with his mother-in-law and his boss. I think I mentioned part of the reason he's known his fiance for a long time because the parents were friends years ago. So the mother-in-law has been in his life for a long time, even before he was married to or engaged to her, and the brother obviously. And then dad is out here. So dad took off at age 7 and did not have any contact with the family for many, many, many years. Around college time, dad sort of resurfaced, and Jay has sort of gradually let the dad back in via text. The dad lives out of state. Via text and occasional emails, the dad occasionally sort of presses Jim to come visit, and that causes some triggers and some upset. This was his timeline that you've already seen. So, I identified that grief and role disputes were his primary triggers to what was going on, and pretty much from the outset. So he came really wanting to lose weight for the pending wedding, but acknowledging that he had a significant binge eating disorder. So he had never labeled it that himself, but as I described it and did a lot of psychoeducation in the early sessions, he was just like, yes, like that is exactly what I had. And I didn't even know that was a thing, and I didn't know men have this. Like I thought it was a girl thing, and I can't believe this is what I've had, going on for me. So we linked his binge eating onset and weight gain with some of the very significant life events. So he remembers his first binges early on, as I read to you, with a loss of relationship with his father and the assumption of care of his brother. And we discussed that he hadn't had the opportunity to grieve the loss of his relationship with his dad, in part because his mom's own grief, and also in part because she was just totally overwhelmed. So she had to start working. She felt totally overwhelmed by her current circumstances, so she just wasn't able to sort of be there for him in the way that he might have needed. His ongoing surrogate father role with his brother was a cause of distress for him, and every time his brother would reach out saying, hey, I need help, my client would hear, like, you didn't do a good job parenting me, basically, even though his brother wasn't saying that. His brother was saying, hey, I need help. But Jay felt such responsibility for caring for his brother that he just felt awful about it. And he saw his wife's comments about the weight and the disputes they had over how to care for the dog as really triggering. And he kept trying to minimize the dog thing, just saying like, look, I love my dog, I don't want to, and it really wasn't about the dog care, right? It was about the different role expectations that had developed between he and his wife. And he would go, if this is how it is with the dog, what's it going to be like when you have a kid, and so forth. So the goals that we talked about were to actually process the loss of his relationship with his dad, to help him reestablish interests in new activities that were not related to his responsibilities of work and being with his dog and fiance. He had really sort of hunkered down because he felt such pressure to maintain financial responsibility. And when you work on commission, you're never off work. So he spent just exorbitant amounts of times following leads and on email and so forth, but had sort of stopped doing anything else. He'd run out of steam by the end of the day. And to work on improvements in communication with his brother and his wife. And so and he was like, I did not feed these to him. These came very naturally to him. He's a very articulate, verbose, insightful guy. And he was really able to see, like, look, my brother sends me a text saying I need $1,000 to make rent, and I'm like stopping at the drive-through within 15 minutes. Like, he's able to link himself what's going on. And you'll find that a lot of patients can do that. So the strategies were, for the grief piece, were to really conduct a reconstruction of what his relationship was like with his dad and what he might have felt like back then, and explore the feelings, and we did just that. So in the treatment contract, I provided feedback. I said, I think this is what's going on. We kind of discussed grief, these role disputes. Let's sort of tackle them one at a time. Let's start with your dad, because I do think that if you have the space to actually process that you'll feel a little bit of relief from doing that. And I imagine that will already sort of give you some space and help reduce your binges. So I sort of put the idea out there that processing this will be related to a decrease in binges. Yeah.
Is the treatment contract opposed to verbal contract?
So classic, like manualized IPT says you should have a written contract. I usually don't really. I just sort of outline, because it's nice later to be able to say, remember we talked about one of the things we would work on is X, Y, and Z. So I make notes again, and well, I don't have like the patient sign it or anything, but and I keep my notes, of course, and so later on, if the patient says, like, oh, I don't want to work on that, I've not really ever had that happen, but you could always reflect back and say, well, that's one of the things we had talked about earlier on, and if you don't want to do that, let's just sort of think about how we might effectively use our time. Because you don't want it to just be this sort of like willy-nilly, I just want to start coming for support, if you're using evidence-based IPT. If, you're you and you're a clinician in practice. So we talked about his inability to have appropriately grieved the loss of his relationship with his father, to effectively set boundaries with his brother now, right? So he was basically just saying yes every time his brother came to him because he didn't know another way of acting, but it was causing a lot of distress. And some conflict with his wife or fiance, because he's giving thousands of dollars to his brother who's never paying him back, and his fiance is like, what's going on? So then he felt compelled to maybe try to hide the fact that he was giving money. Right, you can see where that goes, not good. We talked about difficulty communicating with his wife about both his weight, because she was sort of pushing him around his weight, and about the dog, and his use of food as a primary source of comfort. So he didn't really have much else in his life right now. We developed treatment goals. We decided to contract for around 20 sessions, and these were the treatment goals: to begin to mourn their father, reestablish connection with wife, and sort of sort out some of those disputes through communication analysis and role play, find ways to comfort himself without the use of food, i.e. figure out other things he could do with his time that he might enjoy, find ways to effectively deal with some stressors at work, and improve communication with his brother and his wife. It's a tall order. So we first did this part about sort of letting him grieve his relationship with his dad, and he just, as I said, he just cried, hard sobs, and he really felt it. And now that you guys have done a little bit of role play, and you felt the intensity of sitting with someone when they're struggling about this, you can see how you could get there. It's a little abstract when we're talking on a PowerPoint. When you're sitting with a patient who's in so much pain around something, as you know in not IPT world, that affective experience is really important. And so we just let him cry. And I obviously didn't judge the fact that he was crying, nothing like that. So we just sort of let it happen. And he basically came to session the first couple of weeks like ready to cry. It was almost like he was looking for a space to let it out. He also expressed for the first time he had never really been mad at his mom before, but he was pretty pissed because he saw what she did as abandoning him in his time of crisis. And he was very conflicted about that because he was close to his mom. he knew she was doing the best she could, but here he is thinking like, but I'm still only 8. And asking him to imagine, he had one of his friends from work has an 8-year-old kid, and I asked him to imagine that 8-year-old kid who he felt some connection to, suddenly being in charge of the house, and he had this moment of like, oh my gosh, right? Seeing that 8-year-old and imagining what he went through, and that really opened the door for him to grieve what he lost too, not just the relationship with his dad, but his childhood. Yeah, you had a question?
Oh, I think you answered it, but if a person does the opposite, I tend to see more of this in my practice when they don't cry, they shut down and aren't going to process the grief automatically. Are there other things you can use to help elicit that emotion or?
So that's when that's when I sort of go back on the fact that it's, number one, they've probably been taught that emotion is really safe, right, or accepted, and I might bring that up in the session. Number two, I might sort of do one of those mismatches between, you're talking about the loss of this critically important relationship in your life, and there's no emotion here, and you're just wondering, like, where did how does that work in your life, or where did you learn that, or does your body feel anything? Sometimes I'll tune them into what their physical body is saying, because even if they're not crying, they might be feeling nauseous, or I might observe their body language changes and sort of help them identify. And if all else fails, I might say, if someone, something like it might be normal in this situation or whatever, common in this situation, to feel a lot of sadness, to feel tearful. Wonder if you've ever felt that way. So to sort of give them appropriate lingo for their emotions, because sometimes there is like no clue. They have no connection to the emotional experience and what they're feeling or the language around it. So part of IPT is allowing and teaching people to have and recognize feelings. So you're doing good IPT work if you even just sort of stay there. Yeah. So in these first several sessions, he already reported that his binging was less. He just sort of reported feeling calmer, and he's like, I don't really know why, and I'm like, okay, I think you kind of know why. But he wasn't able to exactly link it, because it wasn't like he was crying about his dad and eating chips, right? But he just was, you could almost sort of see like a decompression, and I think that was helpful. So he started to notice a little bit of a decline in his binging, and without us doing any problem solving or anything, he started to wonder aloud in session, there's this opportunity at my job where I would get a salary for 50% of my time. That would be a stable salary, and I could do 50% stable salary and 50% commission work. And I'm sort of wondering if maybe I should explore that opportunity. So he was already going to the fact like, oh, my work instability is seriously causing problems for me, and I think I need to do something about that. So I, of course, was very encouraging of him to at least explore that option, and I thought, how great that was. And I think that was also partially related to a little bit of the calming, the anxiety already, just the idea that there might be another way to deal with his financial stress. And he's actually said, oh, I'm so used to stuffing my feelings. And one client I had, not him, but another client, a woman, said she literally had an image of whenever she would feel emotion, she would have an image of stepping on a trash can lid, a foot pedal, the lid opening, and her slamming the lid shut. That was the image she had. It was like she started to open and she would shut it. And so we've referenced that imagery a lot. And patients will come up with all kinds of ways of describing what they're experiencing. So I said something like, it's important to you to begin to find ways to communicate your feelings with your wife. There are a number of times when you feel angry and hurt when she comments to you about your eating and your weight, and the two of you are at a bit of an impasse around caring for the dog. And I think we can work on helping you reach some of these difficult conversations. And as you begin to share with her, she too might be able to talk about some of her feelings as well. So kind of normalizing, like, you know, if you try this, you might be surprised at, it might open a line of communication from her end too, and that would be nice. I had some things that he had talked about her personality that made me think that she might be a little open to this. She was in the helping profession, that's part of it, but also she just sort of seemed invested in their relationship. So we used communication analysis and role played several conversations with his wife and brother. The conversations with his brother were really hard for him, but also he felt really like it's time. You know, he did sort of get, like, this is not working in our relationship either, because I'm not even like liking him because I'm feeling too responsible for him, and I really love my brother. And so we role played a lot of different conversations about how he would approach setting a boundary in a gentle, caring way, and he felt really good about those, and then actually did them on the phone.
Try again with
Yeah.
communication styles
Yeah.
and how he matters, but when your client is interacting with someone who might have really not healthy behaviors, maybe like very unhealthy substance use issues, and not necessarily a dangerous situation, but you can see their frustration over time. How do you then look at that? Like if the brother's going to be like a base, he's not able to make healthy enough, what do you do next?
So then I don't keep banging on the same door, because we have a time limited thing, and I will say that, right? I will say, let's look at alternative places that you can get some support around the fact that you're not having this relationship with your brother the way you wish you would, and sort of just go another direction. I mean, in theory, if you weren't interested in sort of sticking to the IPT manualized 20 type sessions thing, you could certainly stay there and offer and keep at it, but depends on your clinical style.
Could you do some like radical acceptance around that?
Absolutely.
Sort of.
Absolutely.
As a,
And then you're just processing the feelings around how does it feel to accept the fact that this is the state of this relationship, and it's probably going to be the state of the relationship. Yeah.
I have a question. The role play that we did, Rachel, she mentioned that every time she has difficulties in relationship, one of the things that she does is end the relationship.
Yeah.
So she doesn't talk to mom, she doesn't talk to the sister, she doesn't talk to the husband.
Yeah.
So, still she talked with two friends and her daughter, which is that she have a positive relation. So I know we have to focus on the now, but when I talk to her, she starts explaining why she doesn't talk to mom or husband or whatever that critical situation and make her feel rejected. So how I can use the past and bring it to the present to help her to, change
Yeah.
that.
So I guess I don't know exactly because there's no right answer, but I would say what my gut is telling me is that I would want to explore, do those relationships feel completely done? Does she feel like I will never speak to my mother again? I will never speak to my friend again or whatever? And if she says, I actually would like to have them, then you have the rest of your sessions probably, because you're going to be working on how do you do that? How do you reopen a relationship that has been closed?
But she said, no, mom, for me, just call her is a task. I just say hello, and that's it. Yeah. So, can you, what I try to ask is, can you use her past, the information from the past relationship with mom to help her, not probably to go back to the same relationship, but to probably move for the future. With that
Absolutely.
relationship. Okay.
And it's going to be important in termination
Yeah.
to terminate or conclude treatment differently. And I would be really explicit about the fact that endings of relationships haven't always been amicable or safe or healthy for you. And so we're going to basically do that differently here. And in that case, I might absolutely contract for maintenance treatment, mainly because you want to sort of model that you can change the dynamic of the relationship without it being a hard and fast end, and that that's okay. And so I would be thinking of all those things during termination.
Maybe help her to focus on the relationship that she had, that works for her, and use that model for future
Yes.
relationships.
Yes.
Okay.
His wife did join one session where we discussed the diagnosis of binge eating disorder, and what that meant for him, and he was really appreciative of that, and she mostly got it, not 100%, but she did hear that this is a real thing, this isn't made up in his head, and that there's things that he's going to be doing differently as he's working on reducing his triggers that will probably affect you, and we hope in a positive way, but that it's going to feel different. So we sort of set the stage, and you guys might experience this where clients will sometimes use like, well, my therapist and I talked about as a conversation starter, and so, you know, for better or for worse, if that's what patients feel comfortable broaching new conversations, then like, it's still better than not talking in a lot of circumstances.
You just mentioned bringing his wife in for a session.
Yep.
And then the example we had yesterday, today, the father was going to come in.
Yep.
When in IPT do you think about those sessions? I mean, is it common that you do it? Does it happen once or twice? What's the thinking?
So I've had it happen, and I might say, now in like the IPT group stuff, part of it was a manualized program, and we had every parent come in. So that's a different case. In private practice, I would say I've had it happen about a third of the time. And it's really about, you know, the person, the situation, the realities of that. I had one client who absolutely could have benefited from bringing her husband in, but he's one of these like works 90 hours a week, will never take time off, is certainly not going to take time off on a Tuesday at noon to come see me. You know, like, so there's like real life limitations to that. As we sort of were wrapping up, he reviewed the changes he made in his eating, especially as related to improvements in his grief and his communication skills. He was really articulate in talking about how much better he felt after just grieving, and he became aware that his work environment had intensified those feelings of stress and anxiety. And in fact, part of the frustration he had around caring for the dog was feeling like, I'm on commission and every moment I'm not at the office is a moment I'm not earning money. And so as he started exploring this alternative work situation, his anxiety about the dog even started to come down, even as he was in negotiation with his wife, but you sort of saw how much that, I didn't even pick up in the very beginning, honestly, about how much that was weighing on him. But as we kept going, it became more and more evident. And he talked a lot about sharing with his wife. He had talked about his grief experience with his wife, talked about what we did in session, and she had been really supportive, and he was a little surprised by that. He sort of thought she'd seen him as like, come on, dude, it happened, you know, how long ago? And she wasn't like that. And I think that also helped them. He made a plan to decrease his work stress and also to continue sharing his thoughts and feelings with his wife. And we contracted for maintenance treatment because, again, I think I mentioned he was ending right around the holidays and he was going to be spending a lot of time with his family. He thought his dad might resurface during the holidays, as he often did. He knew food triggers would be really high, et cetera, et cetera. So we just made a contract to do that. We met every other week for 4 sessions, and then we met monthly. And we were just really trying to continue to address these relationship issues. So that's the case of Jay, full circle. Due to time, I'm not going to go through the case of S, but you have that example. And I think what I'm going to do is go through, so we only have an hour left. Do you want to take like a 5-minute break, and then we're ending at 1?
12:30.
Oh, 12:30? Oh, okay, so no break, sorry. Okay, I thought I had on my agenda 1 o'clock. Okay, no problem. I think maybe an old agenda was printed in the book, but okay. So we're going to go through the group adaptations, okay? So is anybody actually going to do group here? 3 maybes, 4 maybes, okay.
I'm
So,
curious about the option of group in a college counseling center, what we have very limited spots.
so here's why I love group. It is an interpersonal laboratory, right? The work you see happening in the group setting is a reflection of what's happening in those people's lives. So and for some people people who particularly have interpersonal deficits, like imagine Rachel, if you brought her into a group with similar people, her isolation is significantly reduced. Just that experience of talking to real live other people who she might not have to feel ashamed around, just that is healing in and of itself. So it's also pretty cost effective for patients. So if there's the book going around, the IPTG or IPT for group, but basically you want to do 3 individual sessions: pre-group, mid-group, and post-group. And the rest of the contact with that patient is in group setting. In the individual sessions, the first one is a long session where you're doing the interpersonal inventory and closeness circle. In the mid-group, you're discussing progress, sort of like you would in an individual session. You're discussing what progress they've made toward their goals and what it's going to look like for the remainder of the group. And in the post-group, you're really reflecting on the progress and making a plan for what work they're going to continue doing after the group has ended. So the key...
I'm sorry, so those 3 things you were speaking to were individual sessions?
Individual sessions, yes. The keys of the group format are that it's semi-structured, and there is a particular treatment focus. Now I'll get a little more into that in just a second. And we're really focused on using the group to change the relationships that are going on outside the group. And the group leader is active, engaged, all you would expect with an IPT therapist. Usually I find the best numbers between 7 and 10. If you get a little lower than that, then you end up with occasional couples therapy when like 3 people can't come or something like that, and that just gets a little awkward. If you have more than that, then there's a little bit of difficulty having people have time to process and do the work. So that's my experience too. And you want to have it homogeneous in terms of diagnosis. So I would not do an IPT for eating disorder group with someone with anorexia nervosa and binge eating disorder. I would have people with binge eating disorder, or people with subclinical binge eating disorder and full-blown binge eating disorder, as long as they're sort of pretty close in terms of diagnostic background. And what you get when you do that is, number one, this pretty quick cohesion that happens, because a lot of times people have never experienced interacting with people that have similar eating habits as them, and it's really normalizing. And people often feel really understood when they're in a group of people who are similar to them. So this is what it might look like in terms of a treatment structure. So pre-group meeting, mid-group meeting, and post-group meeting, those are all the individual meetings. This is in the Wilfley book. This is what the stages of group development that we often see. So initially, you get sort of a lot of engagement, and people want to create a functioning group, and you set the tone as the group leader to set an engaging, functioning group. And then immediately, you get a little bit of differentiation. So people start to get a little like questioning of you or questioning of the treatment process. That's all fine and normal. Just sort of know that that's a part of group therapy. If you've never done any group therapy before, you might not have had experience doing this, and I encourage you to do your homework on group therapy in general first before you dive into an IPT group, because this is all pretty standard for group dynamics anyway. And then you're focusing on the actual work. So in the sessions, patients are doing with each other what we did today. So we'll give them an example, like if it was adolescents, and I'm going to show you an example later, we might say, in the very beginning, we might give them a role play until they feel more comfortable coming in with their own example. But like, my mom set a curfew of 9 p.m. and texted me every 5 seconds after 9 p.m. when I was just sitting in the driveway finishing up my song. Like, how do I talk to her about that? And then we sort of let them go. We get the group members involved in the feedback, and it's really sort of engaging, especially in this homogeneous group of people, and they're like, oh, I've sort of been there before, or I can relate to that, then you get a lot of engagement. And then termination, you got to start preparing for this early, because when people feel cohesive in a group, and when they feel understood, guess what happens? They don't want it to go away, right? And so you have to start preparing them from early on. This is a time-limited group. You have an end date in mind that they have on their calendars, and so you sort of really start working with that. It's really cool to watch, and I encourage, I give people the permission to do this, like, but when you see one person in the group rephrase a sentence in a role play for another patient, I'm like, I couldn't have done it better myself, and I'm so glad I didn't say anything, because it's so much more powerful when another group member says, like, oh, when you said that, I was thinking this way, and then like, bam, beauty, it's amazing. And it's always so much easier, right, to think about what you would say when it's someone else's problem than when it's your own. So people get pretty good at listening for that. The group is suggesting alternatives and really active and engaged. So still the same phases, the initial phase, the intermediate phase, and the termination phase. The initial phase is that interpersonal formulation. The intermediate phase is a focus on the problem areas and the goals, making connections between the problem areas and the goals and the eating behavior or whatever, depression. And termination, maintaining group work while preparing for the group to end.
So you do the same type of, it's just like the individual work that you're doing, but you're doing it in the group format?
Yeah, and if you've ever, has anybody led groups before? Okay, so if you've led groups before, you sort of get how it's a similar process, but with a whole new dynamic going on, and it's the same with IPT. You know, instead of me doing all of the feedback, this person over here, there's always like someone who can chime in with a good communication alternative or something, so you're sort of drawing on the group and using all the same skills you have in other group settings.
And would a group typically be the same time frame, like about the 20 sessions?
Yes,
60?
yes. Usually, I think they're 12 to 16 usually, but again, do what works for you. You know, if 20 feels like your speed and what's right for you, then do that. So, again, this is all very similar to the individual work. You're transparent to the patient, you're summarizing the interpersonal inventory and setting the stage. At the end of that individual pre-group meeting, you're saying, you know, like, these are some things that I think that we've decided together would be things for you to work on, goals during the group, so that you have something to circle back to throughout the group. We've talked about the fact that when groups are homogenous in terms of diagnosis, that it really does help with cohesion. Just a little bit of an example of what this looks like. So a high structured group would be a psychoeducational skills focused group, like a 6-week sleep hygiene or stress management group, highly focused. Moderately focused or moderately structured might be a CBT group where there's stuff you're going to teach them and get through. You know, like you're going to teach about cognitive distortions and you're going to review a thought record and, you know, week by week by week you have an exact plan, but there's obviously room for individual variation. This is, interpersonal is a little less structured than that. You have a plan, but it's really fed by the patients. So when they're bringing in disputes, when they're bringing in communication role plays, you have a tool, but you're really going with what the patients bring in. And then the least structured would be a dynamic therapy group, interpersonal process. Yeah.
I'm just curious how you structure it. Like, do you do a check-in with each patient every session? And if they have anything in particular they want to bring up, or do you bring up a topic and say, does anybody have anything?
So usually what happens is that people have had, in the active work phase, people have stuff that they were going to do. And so you're following up with that person. You know, like, Mary, you were going to talk to your mom about her texting you all the time. How did that go? And so then you'd be talking to her about that. And then, you know, last week, Joan, we didn't get to talk to you about the thing that you had brought up about, you know, fighting with your sister. Is that still something you want to bring up today? So you're sort of going with what the patients come in with. I don't bring up a topic. You know, it's driven by the clients.
And I usually, How long will the session, the group sessions about?
60 to 90 minutes,
60 to
depending
90.
on what, yeah. So again, the initial phase is really elaboration of goals, talking about, and a lot of times there's shared goals. Oh, I want to learn to communicate to my mom better. That usually more than one person sitting in the room in an adolescent group has that goal. And so they will sort of find each other as well. And that breeds a lot of personality, a lot of acceptance, and our job is to give hope, right? That empathic, encouraging, engaged stance that you take is hope engendering for the patients in the group. The primary goal is to create a functional group. You want to, self-disclosure promotes group cohesion, and that's on the part of the patient. So you want them to open up a little bit, because the minute they start opening up, other people are feeling more connected to them. You're looking for affect. So again, just like in individual work, you're looking for things that cause tearfulness or I thought I plugged it in, sorry. And I always just start out with the idea that you guys are gonna, this is gonna work. That's my fundamental stance. Sorry, guys. And I think that does help facilitate cohesion, because I assume that people will use this time together. And I keep reinforcing, we have limited time together, let's make the best of it, like someone over here said earlier. The intermediate phase is a lot of linking, same stuff as individual, linking. We do in group a weekly assessment of symptoms. Again, in group, I usually do that in writing. Just a quick checklist, just because I don't want to spend valuable actual group time assessing each single person. If someone on that little checklist has, suddenly a week where they have 7 binges and they've been doing well, that's a clue to me to maybe, nudge that a little bit and ask, boy, it looks like you had a rough week. What was going on related to the work you're doing here? And I noticed it had a lot of impact on people. And then they go. So you maintain your focus on the problem area just like an individual and facilitate progress towards your interpersonal goals. So as the group progresses, you sort of get away from worrying about the cohesion of the group and start working more on individual problem areas. That's just the nature of group experience, as you probably know from leading other groups. And each individual person is working toward his or her own goal, and you're simultaneously sort of watching those people work toward their goals. And I think it's really powerful when you have someone who takes the lead early, as often is the case, someone who jumps in and starts doing the work, that motivates other people really quickly, because they see, and as long as you're explicit, like, oh, boy, you've had a reduction in your binges since you started communicating differently to your mom, then the 6 other people sitting in the room are like, oh, maybe there is something to this, right? Like, I've seen my peer experience that. When you have a mid-treatment review, you just meet with the person individually, and it's just like a regular session where you're talking about how are you progressing on your goals, how do you want to use the rest of the time here, very similar to an individual work. And you do start setting the stage. We only have 8 sessions left. So again, really reinforcing the idea that this is not lasting forever. You know about the therapeutic stance, it's all the same. So this is, I like this image because it shows that the relevant interpersonal problem area that you're working on in the group is directly related to the problems that you're having outside the group. And so in groups, sometimes what will happen, especially when you're working with adolescents, is there'll be like a snipe between 2 people in the room, and you can certainly use that as an example, depending on your group style and what you feel most comfortable with. But you could certainly address in the session, boy, when Jane said that, Mary, you had your body told us that was not okay, and that even just that language says your body language speaks volumes to me, right? And you're sort of giving them feedback on what it looks like when they have an emotional reaction. Again, you explicitly discuss termination, you outline goals for the remaining work, and formulate specific plans for continued work after treatment. Old losses sometimes get reactivated when you end a group or a therapy relationship. So just know that going into it and be cognizant for factors. Feelings of not getting enough time or being rejected, boy. If you have someone who has felt like they're not heard in other parts of their life, and you come around to termination and they're like, I haven't spent one group talking, be prepared for them to be thinking, like, I'm not being heard again, and that brings up lots of emotion. To me, that's where our clinical intake, we're having to be thinking about each person because we've learned, oh, the person often has relationships where they don't feel heard, so I need to be, as a group therapist, on alert for that, but also reading body language. You can see so much from people if they're sitting down, like, glaring at you, they're telling you something. There is all sorts of stuff that happens at the end of these sessions, especially with adolescents. People sing, people try to bring gifts to each other, people hug, people write poems, some people don't show, a whole range of things. I don't have many right answers for how to deal with all of that, other than I try to set expectations for it. At the end of the group, you might feel like doing X, Y, and Z, and you have to decide for yourself as a clinician if you're comfortable with that or not. And if you're not, then just set the expectation so that the person who comes bringing a gift doesn't feel bad about bringing it. If you said 6 weeks before, people do lots of things at the end of group, and I know it might be tempting to want to bring, your favorite CD to Jane, but we don't do that because not everybody has the resources or whatever reason you give. So you set the expectation ahead of time.
I presume it's a closed group.
Closed group, absolutely, yes. In the termination individual meeting, what you're doing is what you would be doing at the end, reviewing progress, making a plan for the future. I wanted to show you this, there's a free group IPT for depression manual available, and I gave you the web address there from the World Health Organization. It should be at the bottom of the slide with a picture. And again, if you need any of these addresses, just reach out to me. I can email them directly to you. But that link at the bottom is a PDF version that should take you to it. And if not, you can Google World Health Organization Group Interpersonal Psychotherapy Manual, and you will find it. It's free.
That's a pretty group manual?
Yeah, for IPT for depression, not eating disorder specific, but for depression. So I think in the interest of time, you guys, I'm actually not going to do the IPT-WG stuff because it's the same. It's just specific for weight gain prevention. I think what I'd rather do is just spend our few last minutes talking about troubleshooting. So, some common things that come up. One, if there's lack of clarity about the problem area, then you pretty quickly run into problems in intermediate sessions because you don't know what you're supposed to be working on, and neither does the patient. So getting clear in the beginning is really critical. It doesn't mean there's a right answer. It means you have a path. I often think of, if I want to get from here to Boston, I could take, 95, or I could take a different path. They're both going to get me there, but I can't be wishy-washy in which one I'm going to take, right? I have to commit. And that's sort of like IPT. It doesn't mean 95 is better than the back roads. It depends on the person in front of you. So pick your plan with your patient and go for it. You can revise, of course, right? If you run into some major traffic jam, you might bail out, as we talked about yesterday. But in general, there's no perfect answer. There's no one way of conceptualizing a case, as you know. But once you've landed on it, get clear about it. And if you do that, it's easier to stay focused. In group, allowing a particular patient to monopolize time can be a problem. Some patients are particularly boisterous or use up a lot of group time, and that is challenging, right? But it's our job as the leader to sort of make sure we're aware of that. Again, we've talked a lot about this one, but too much focus on the symptoms of the eating behavior and not enough linking to the actual interpersonal relationship. So you want to stay linked, stay focused on the interpersonal relationship. And then allowing patients to sort of ramble. I mean, okay, so let's be really honest. If you see a lot of patients, a lot of days a week, we're not our best 100% of the time, right? That's just a reality. If your dog woke you up at 3 a.m., you're just not your best some of the time. And it's really easy to think like they're going for it and to sort of sit back and let it unfold, right? I know, I'm a therapist too, I'm in private practice, I know it's hard. And so as much as possible, sort of gin yourself up for the idea that, look, if that happens one session, just bring it back the next week, but really try to keep focused on the interpersonal relationship, rather than sort of letting the client wander around, particularly on a day when you're sort of distracted or tired or whatever. So you really want to try to be active and engaged as much as you can. I mean, I know that's all the time, but it's particularly important where people are going to want to talk about the eating, and you're going to sort of want to bring it back to the relationship.
And so are you upfront with that in sort of the educational piece? You say like, this is what you sort of explain that that's what,
Absolutely.
I'll often say, I see my job as a therapist.
Absolutely.
So you.
Absolutely. That's a great way of doing it. Yeah.
Upfront, you say,
Yeah, in the early sessions, you can be talking about how, it's totally understandable to want to talk about your eating, and this treatment is going to keep sort of bringing us back to the relationships. And so you might hear 5 sessions from now, me sort of interrupt you and very gently say, let's go back to that work on relationships. So then you set the stage. They expect it, even though they might not like it. Not pushing the patients to make change, and pushing is an awkward word, I know, but if you focus on the fact that this is time-limited treatment, and you want for the patient that they get the most possible out of it, it sort of sets up this expectation that there's work to be done outside of session. So I think just the nature of the time-limited piece does help encourage people to do some work. One-way communication is either you just talk all the time, or they just talk all the time. It's really a dialogue. So if you have people who are non-responders, of course that happens, you could of course consider CBT or another evidence-based treatment. And again, I think I mentioned earlier that some aspects of CBT do show up in IPT if you want it to, symptom monitoring, etc. But if someone is sort of just like, I don't really want to work on these relationships, like this just isn't working for me, then it's not our job to force that, right? Our job is to then say, like, let's make an appropriate referral, just like you would in another case. Another thing, so again, if you think that the patient isn't able to do the outside work because the social anxiety is to their roof, or because they can't get out of bed in the morning, then this is a really appropriate time to think about medication consultation. Because, and I will often describe it as like, let's sort of get your biology on your side so that you can then engage the work that we're doing here in a different way. So there are people that, if you've ever worked with people with real deep depression, they're not having these conversations, right? They're barely making it through the day. Even if the relationship cannot be improved, patients sometimes feel relief just by feeling like they have a voice. I feel like that, and maybe that's my self-talk to make myself feel better, I don't know, but I really do see that. I think people feel better if they feel like they're at least trying, or they have a voice, or they've expressed their feelings. And I'm really careful to make sure I talk about what would you, what do you expect from this interaction? And if you, for this role play that you're doing, this conversation you're gonna have with your dad, and what happens if it goes, is there a chance that even if he doesn't respond the way we think he will, or even if he totally blows you off, that you might leave feeling like, at least I sort of stood up for myself for once. And I just give that to the patient. Maybe that's true, maybe not, but often people feel like, okay, at least I'm sort of trying. And that can go a long way. Again, we've talked a lot about this, seeking additional sources of support if the primary relationship is just not going to happen. So then you don't force that issue. You work on getting enough support around the loss of that relationship. And then remember, even that, so sort of to the radical acceptance idea, even just acknowledging that the expectations, like I really always hope that me and my dad will get closer, and he's addicted to heroin, and like that might just not happen. And even just changing the expectations can make a person feel sad, but also a little relieved, right? Because there's less sort of urgency around making this relationship better if they sort of realize maybe it's not going to be what I had wished it would be. There are some people that are not a particularly good fit for IPT. Active alcohol or drug use and dependence, active psychosis, actively suicidal and homicidal, severe cognitive deficits, and severe interpersonal deficits. We've already talked about that. People who have no desire for close relationships, this therapy is not going to sort of work for them very well. Two last things. Social media. We could do like a whole 2-day workshop on social media and communication. I don't have any right answers. I will just say that I always default to the old-fashioned talking is the best option. That isn't always going to happen, especially if you're working with teenagers. I've done things like crafted text and emails together, because if that's the way that patient is going to communicate, then at least we work on it together. Patients will sometimes bring in text and want to read the exchange, and we'll talk about, kind of like in a communication analysis, what do you think, if you had said this, what's another way you could have said this one? And how do you think that might have changed the dynamic of this conversation? So in some ways, having a record of what was said is sort of a cool opportunity, but of course there's so many misunderstandings and misattribution of feelings around things. It's really complicated. I basically say social media posts are not communication. I say social media posts are notifications. And if you want to work on communication, then we're going to communicate via in-person, by the phone, or text, email last. But we do not use social media for communication. We use social media for notification. 99% of my clients get that. I'm sure you'll have some that disagree with me, but that's my sort of bottom line around it. But there's a lot of work to be done there. And then very last but not least, this on the IPT Institute website, free for all clinicians, are IPT adherence and quality scales. So if you were supervising people who were doing IPT, you could sort of do a checklist of like, oh, did they review the problem area? Did they do an interpersonal inventory? And what a cool tool if you're learning IPT to look at it, right? And to sort of go through and think about, oh, have I been doing this? How would I rate myself on that? As an experienced clinician, you have the flexibility to sort of rate your own experience a little bit. So those are free. I would encourage you to go after them and look at them. Again, those are not eating disorder specific, but because the IPT tools are transdiagnostic, you'll still get a really good flavor of the things that are included in there. Okay. 2 minutes late. Did you put that site, the address back up again? This one, yeah. I do have a couple printed copies of the adherence scales up here, if you want them. If you want to just glance through. Yeah. Anybody else want to just flip through the IPTs if you're in wellness skills? So my email address is on the last slide. If you want to contact me, I would be more than happy to consult with you or to answer questions, to hear how awesome I am. Just kidding. It's been really awesome working with you guys, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you.